Alright, so for today's project I'm going to get a bunch of different types of wood. I'm going to glue them all together, have them all crooked and stuff. And then I'm going to put a clock in it. It's going to have some good size. It's going to take up a good bit of wall space. Yeah, it's going to be pretty exciting. Can't wait to see how this thing turns out. Let's get started. Alright, to start this project out, we're going to have to mill down some wood. And the woods I'm going to use here is cherry. I'm going to use walnut, sapele, maple. I'm going to use cherry a second time. It's the only one I'm going to use twice. Then there's going to be zebra wood, then yellow maple, and some redwood is going to make its way in there too. So this is going to be a wide piece. So these boards are going to be pretty long, and the glue ups are going to be really long. But it's also going to be a really thin piece, so making sure you have a properly jointed edge is going to be really important for this glue up to hold for a long period of time. It's not super critical to get all of these boards to be the exact same thickness as each other, but if you want to save yourself a good bit of sanding and work later on, it'd be nice to do that at this point in this project. If your joiner is wide enough to handle it, it's a good idea to get a flat side of your board on your jointer. That way it's not pressing down and actually flattening your board out before sending it through the blades like the planer does. That way whenever you come to the planer, you're putting the flat side down on the tray and then running it through the planer to get the other side flat, and then you'll get that thickness perfect for your glue up. Alright, now it's time to slap together that first glue up. Alright, so now I'm going to work on milling out some pieces of wood to glue in there, kind of crooked to give it more of an eye-catching effect, a little bit more of an artistic appearance to this piece. For this I'm going to use red heart and yellow maple. With where I'm going to send them through this piece, I think it's going to give a pretty sharp contrast from the other pieces of wood that it's going through. And this is where it would be nice to have one of them big fancy sliding table saws. But I'm going to freehand cut this across the table saw and get nice and sketchy with it, and try to cut that line nice and straight, and then we'll go to the joiner and get that edge nice and perfectly jointed, and then glue this thing together. Something to remember when you do this, you don't want to end up gluing end grain against side grain when you do this, so you want to avoid that if you can. What I try to use as a rule of thumb is 40 degrees. I don't want my angle to be any more than 40 degrees. That way it's pretty much side grain to side grain glue up. Because if you glue up end grain to side grain, that glue joint will not last at all. Now, due to the angle of the glue up, you're going to want to put a clamp across sideways all three of those pieces, because when you go to clamp it down the regular long way like we did when we glued the original panel together, it'll cause those pieces to slide with the glue there. So you will need that piece to go across there to prevent that sliding. Then we'll do it all over again for the yellow maple piece. You'll probably notice that I have another jointer here, and that's because the other jointer I was using, I was starting to have some troubles with the hardware to the adjustable table coming loose, and it actually started to show up in my joints. So I went up and bought this thing. It's a little bit bigger. Went from a 6-inch to an 8-inch wide, and trying this out for a spin. Again, we're going to glue this up the same exact way. You want to have that clamp that goes from side to side going across all three pieces again. That way it don't slip and slide out of alignment. That clamp, it's not really tight. You don't clamp it down super tight. You just set it so that it holds everything in place. And then when you clamp everything else down, it'll draw that tighter for it. Alright, so now I'm going to draw a rough circle for how big this clock's going to be, and then I'm going to lop off the corners so that it will fit in my jig on the table saw. And I'm going with a rough circle here because I have commitment issues when it comes to making projects without any plans or anything. I have a hard time just making a decision on a size until it's time that I have to make that decision. Then I just roughly cut that out on the bandsaw. And now I'm going to make a rotation shaft that temporarily glues to the back of this clock. And what that's going there for is for the jig that goes on the table saw to carve out the clock. It holds it still and allows me to spin it in a circle. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this piece here, we're going to glue it down right there, right in the middle of your piece. Hopefully it's right in the middle. The thing to pay attention to is make sure you're gluing it with the grain going the same way that the wood piece grain is, because this glue joint here is going to be very important to you given what we're doing with it. So we want to make sure this glue joint holds up, even though we're going to saw it off later. And I'll just throw my 20-pound clamp on it. Alright, and this is the jig I used to carve out the clock face. It's actually a jig that's used to carve out the butt grooves and seats, but I changed the bridge to it to be able to use it for clock faces so that I can carve perfect circular clocks. To use this jig, you actually stand to the back side of it. That way, if something goes wrong and you end up with like some table saw kickback for some reason, it flies away from you instead of at you, which is kind of nice. Now, along those lines of safety, you're going to want to go to your table saw manufacturer and your blade manufacturer to make sure they're going to be okay with you doing this. Because what we're doing here is we're using the side of the blade to actually carve out this clock. So whenever you're rotating it, you're putting side load on that blade, and your table saw and your blade might not be made for that. So please contact those manufacturers and make sure they are okay with you using their equipment like this. Now, to minimize the risk associated with side loading your table saw and your saw blade, you want to do this slowly. Don't fight your blade too much. You want to just gently rotate that thing around so that it's just taking off just a little bit at a time. You don't want to put a bunch of pressure on that blade while you do this. But anyway, what we're doing here is you set this up with your bridge the whole way forward, and that puts your blade right at the middle of your piece. And you have your blade all the way down, and then before you put your piece up there, you want to count rotations to get that blade up to the height that you want to go to, and then you rotate that many rotations down until it goes down into the table, and then do like a rotation up, spin your piece around, do another rotation up, spin your piece around until you get the blade height that you're going for. Then what you'll notice is I have a piece of all thread threaded into the jig on each side that's centered up with the middle of the blade. And then there's a hole in the bridge every half an inch going down the whole side of each side of the bridge. And I'll move one side, one hole at a time, and I'll do a spin, and then I'll go to the other side, move it one hole, and then I'll do a spin. That way I'm just moving it a quarter of an inch towards the blade with every pass. Now this does take a lot of time, and you are putting a lot of use into your table saw doing this, so keep that in mind. And what I did here is about halfway through I took a break for an hour to let the saw and the blade cool down, and then I finished, because that way we're not generating a bunch of heat in our saw and or our blade. This process does take about an hour of cutting, so it is a little bit much for a table saw that's not an industrial made saw. This whole process creates a ton of sawdust, so you might want to plan for that. You see I'm wearing a respirator. Yeah, if you want to do this outside, definitely. I've done it outside before and it did make life a lot easier, but for some reason I stepped back inside for this one, and it made a mess of everything. I do have the hole where the blade comes up through the jig a little bit wider so that the sawdust has more opportunity to come down through the jig. But even with that, you still want to make sure your sawdust isn't building up underneath your piece, because that can cause your piece to be wavy whenever it's cut out, and then you end up having to sand all that away later. Another little trick I did with this jig is I put measurements on the front side of the jig that tells me how far away my edge is from the blade. And this is the moment of truth where you actually get to see what you've done for the last hour, which is the scary part of using this jig, is you don't actually get to see what you're doing until you flip it over at this point. And this is why you should wear a mask when you do this. Whew. At least that much would have went into my lungs and in my sinuses and would have gave me a heck of a time. I need better dust collection. Alright, now that I'm done with this guy, it's time to cut it off and sand the back of it nice and flat where it was. Now it's sanding time, my least favorite part of any job. The thing to remember with this is whenever you're using a table saw, it is going to leave some kind of grooves and some ugly waves to it. So I start at about a 40 grit, and then I'll go up to 60, then 80, then 120, then over 200 to get this thing nice and smooth. But yeah, it's kind of a process with this project, because the table saw does help you out a lot with this, but it don't do you much favors whenever it comes to sanding. But yeah, once I get past the 80 grit with the sanding, I do it just like any other project. I get my pencil out and cover it with my Keep 'em Honest lines, and I sand them all off. I'll do that twice with each grit here to make sure I get a nice smooth finish. Alright, so I glued some wall spacers to the back of it, little spacers that will just rest against the wall. I made these a little bit extra thick, probably didn't need to go that thick, but I'm going to use these to screw in my mounting hardware for the wiring setup I'm going to use to hang it on a wall. I went with this setup because it's a big, wide, awkward piece, but it's also actually really light due to how thin we made this piece. And I wanted to be able to hang it up on one screw, and then also make it easy to get it to hang on that one screw, so that it's not something that's super hard to hit the screw with. Due to how wide this piece is, with two anchor points, it didn't want to sit flat against the wall. It kind of let the top hang out a little bit. So I went with a third anchor point at the top to make sure it's set flush against the wall. Now I actually hung the piece on the wall, and then I got a straight edge and a level, and I'm going to use that to find the perfect 12 o'clock, the perfect 6 o'clock, the perfect 3 and 9 o'clock, and then we'll use those reference points to set out the rest of our times. Now this project here is actually a Christmas gift that I'm making for my grandfather, and what I'm doing here is using these little acrylic magnetic photo frames as the numbers instead of having actual numbers on the clock. And those photo frames will hold my grandfather's grandchildren and their families. Before I started this, I cut out a piece of paper that's the exact shape of the photo frames, and then I traced out where the magnets are on a piece of paper and cut little holes in the corners where the magnets are. And then I'll go around and replace those frames with that piece of paper and draw out where all the magnets will make contact with the piece. And then we'll drill some holes and put some hardware in there. Now I am drilling these out with a countersink bit, and it's pretty important to get your depth right on this. If you end up countersinking them too much, then the hardware will not grab onto the magnet. And if you don't go in far enough, then it'll stick out a little bit and probably scratch up your acrylic frames as somebody tries to slide them around or get the photos out and move them around and put other photos in them. Then for the hardware, I'm just using steel Phillips head screws with a bolt in the back of it. No real need to make them super hard or anything. All they're there for is for something for the magnetic photo frames to grab a hold of so that it holds it to the clock for you. Then I'll just knock off the imperfections that the drill caused with sander and anything else I found along the way. And now we'll drill a hole and make sure the clock fits in there properly. I did end up having to route out the back of the clock a little bit so that the depth was right for it. Alright, so now we'll spray some lacquer on this thing. I went with 4 coats on this. I went with the spray kind because I find it to be a lot easier to use because I don't end up with brush strokes or a bunch of runs everywhere or bristles in my finished product. So I always go with the spray kind. It's a little more expensive, but I find it to be a lot easier and worth the price, really. Alright, so that's the finished piece. If you like this project, do me a favor, hit that like button. If you want to see more projects like this, hit the subscribe button and that notification bell to let you know the next time I post one of these videos. Until next time, make something awesome.